So why don't we bring Joshua on?
Hello, Keith. Thank you so much.
So thanks for joining us, Joshua. Great to have a fellow Ohioan here to present, to sort of kick off it's morning time for us here in Ohio.
That's right.
Let's see, any sort of, I'll let you introduce yourself and UXP Cleveland a little bit, and then just jump right into your UX and Agile story. You've given me a little bit of a preview, so I know that there's some good juicy tidbits, some things for us to discuss as a community. This is really part of our we theme, right, where we're talking about user experience as a practice, and in this case, how we interact with other practices such as Agile software developers. Exactly. So Joshua, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks so much. I'm going to jump right in, and I will talk about UXPA Cleveland and also the most interesting topic, which is myself. But before I do that, I know everyone is going to want the slide deck, so I like to tell you right up front where you can get it. You can go to tinyurl.com/24HOUX-GBU. So that's 24 hours of UX, good, bad, ugly. So tinyurl.com/24HOUX-GBU. You can get this slide deck. I do speak rather quickly, so you'll have that to refer back to when you wonder, wait, what did he say? He went over it very fast. As Keith mentioned, I am the president of the Cleveland chapter of UXPA, the User Experience Professionals Association. It is an international organization that exists to support people who research, design, and evaluate the user experience of products and services. Now, UXPA International has chapters all over the world. Hopefully there's one near you, wherever you are geographically. But if not, they also offer all of the chapters, as well as International itself, offer a lot of virtual and online resources. So please check them out at uxpa.org. If you're feeling like traveling, you can still get tickets to the UXPA International Conference coming up June 21st through 23rd in lovely San Diego, California. Tell you a little bit about myself. As Keith mentioned, my name is Joshua Randall. I am a product designer at a company called RevLocal. You can see the logo there, big in the middle and red on blue. We are a digital marketing provider for local businesses. So we do local search optimization, review marketing, social media, and much more. If you're in the United States and any of that sounds interesting to you and you're a bricks and mortar business, because we don't do e-commerce yet, please visit us at revlocal.com. Shameless plug completed. Talking through my career progression, you can see all the different places that I've worked in information technology over the last 25 years. I started out my career as a business analyst. I've worked at a lot of the big Cleveland, Ohio companies, some of which you might have heard of: American Greetings, Progressive Insurance, Medical Mutual, Sherwin-Williams, and others. I then moved into user experience design and with a stop in Agile along the way. Looking at my educational background, I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Yale University, which goes to show you, you never know where your career will take you. I never thought I would be working in IT, but it has been a fun ride. And I have a master's degree in user experience design from Kent State University. And I'm now also an adjunct instructor in that program. So the circle of life continues. What are we going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to tell you why I chose the good, the bad, and the ugly as my organizing principle. I think we need to talk about some definitions. What is Agile and what is user experience design? Of course, as a philosophy major, I would think that. Going to tell you why the UXer and the Agilist should be friends. But then I'm going to explain why we can't get along. Go through the attempts at reconciliation over the years. I will sum up and give you some recommendations and then take your questions and answers. And by the way, if you want to pop into the Q&A now, in addition to firing up some questions for me that I will look at the end, I also have some polls active in there. I will mention them and look at them throughout the presentation, but all of them are active now. If you want to go ahead and answer those polls, you can either do it when I talk about them as they come up, or you can do it in advance. Another thing I want to say, Agile and UX design, of course, are both giant topics, giant domains of knowledge. I can really only touch on them here in the time we have together. So there's much more to say about all of these things. The good, the bad, and the ugly, or il buono, il brutto, il cattivo. Hopefully I didn't butcher the Italian too badly. It's an absolutely fantastic movie. If you ever get the chance to see it on a big screen, you absolutely should, because the director, Sergio Leone, is a master of that vast widescreen canvas. It has an instantly recognizable score by Ennio Morricone that's just as much a character as the ones played by Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach, and Lee Van Cleef. 2 thumbs up, highly recommended. But this isn't the film studies talk, so you probably want to hear about the good, the bad, and the ugly of Agile and user experience design. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to label certain discussion points as good, bad, or ugly, and I'm going to use little headshots of the characters, and I'm going to go crazy with the graphic effects in PowerPoint, because if you can't go crazy with graphic effects in a talk centered around a movie, when can you? Of course, these are just my educated opinions. You are welcome to disagree, but if you do disagree, think about why. Again, there's that philosophy coming in. It's always about why. All right, first poll. If you haven't filled it out, go ahead and do this now. This is in my Q&A session where the polls are. I'm curious where everyone is from, because after all, this is an international event and I'm representing an organization that's also international. So I'll go ahead and pop over, take a look and see what we're getting in terms of results. Maybe not a lot of people in the poll section just yet, or maybe having some technical glitches because it looks like I'm the only one who voted. But in any case, I am here at this map pin in Cleveland, Ohio, on the southern shores of Lake Erie in the United States. Undoubtedly, we have people from all over the world. So whether it is your morning, your afternoon, or your evening, welcome and thanks for being here. What is Agile? Here's the definition from my favorite Agilist, a gentleman named James Shore. He is the author of a book called The Art of Agile Development, which I consider the best book ever written on Agile. He recently updated it as of last year. So if you don't have this on your shelf, I highly recommend it. And James Shore writes, well, there isn't a unified Agile method, and that it's really 3 things: the name, the values, and the principles. You can't use Agile or do Agile. You can only be Agile. All right, that's a very fine philosophical definition, but really, James, what is Agile? He goes on to say that Agile is these 5 things: that we rely on people, that we deliver value, that we eliminate waste, that we seek technical excellence, and that we improve our process or your process. If some of these things sound like they come from other disciplines, such as Lean or Kanban, yes, that's entirely intentional. Agile is a bit of a magpie that will happily borrow great ideas from other places. Oh, and by the way, Agile usually means that we do things incrementally and iteratively. Incrementally, we work in small units of work, and iteratively, we repeat our processes over and over because that's how you improve. And we also do that iteration because, as we know on the design side, your first design is never your best design. And even on the software development side, your first code is usually not your best code. So we know a little bit what Agile is. What is user experience design? A famously difficult concept to define. Let's break it down and start with the first term, which is the D in UXD, design. Here are some definitions that I pulled from an old dictionary that I have in my office. I chose it on purpose because its publication date of 1983 predates the modern internet. So it's not possible that this definition of design was influenced by internet design. But you can see whether as a verb or as a noun, design has this concept of intentionality and purposefulness. So whether it's you're conceiving and planning something out or drawing the plans for as a verb, or whether it's as a noun where we say design is deliberate purposive planning, there's that concept of intentionality. Design is not accidental. You could make haphazard or ignorant design decisions, but you're still making a decision. You could effectively outsource your design decisions to a software package, then you're saying that the people who created that software package made the design decisions. Nevertheless, somebody somewhere made an intentional decision, and that is a key aspect of design. Great, so that's the D in UXD. What about the UX? Well, here is the definition from Don Norman. User experience encompasses all aspects of the end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. A classic that has had some pushback over the years. We'll talk about that on the very next slide. One thing that I think gets lost in Don Norman's definition that is actually extremely valuable is he says we need to distinguish UX from the user interface. So if you're ever having a debate, UX versus UI, there's no debate. They're not the same thing. Don Norman said so. End of discussion. We also need to distinguish UX from usability. Usability is a quality attribute and certainly very important to creating a great user experience, but it's not the only attribute of UX. I don't think that a mistake gets made as much here in the year 2022 as the UI mistake gets made. But sometimes people hear the word UX and they think the only thing that matters is usability. That's certainly not true. Now, this is a old and maybe okay definition, but our very own Keith Instone has a presentation that he calls Spins on UX, where he points out that the Don Norman definition leaves a lot to be desired. That's on the bottom row of this table. It's kind of too vague and also too old-fashioned. It leaves out services and brands as opposed to products. It leaves out organizations. And Keith went through a variety of other definitions from various organizations, including the ISO definition and the Lean UX definition that goes along with SAFe, which is an Agile framework. What all of them share is there's some sort of actor who experiences a sensation when they perform some sort of action in a particular context. Keith sums it up and gives his own definition at the top, that UX is the impression that someone gets when interacting with products, services, spaces, brands, systems, and organizations. A much more comprehensive definition. However, if you feel like things are still a little bit vague, we'll give our first movie character here and say, this is kind of ugly. Here we are in UX design, and we're not even really sure how to define what user experience is, or we needed a whole lot of words to try and define it. Well, one of the reasons for that is because of the vast UX landscape that the term UX encompasses. This is a slide from Darren Hood, and it gives you a sense for how big this domain of knowledge can be. I don't expect you to be able to read all the small words on this graphic, but if you look at the big ones in the corners, we can conceptualize UX into four main groups. User research, which is the underpinning of all design work, or at least should be the underpinning of all design work. Information architecture, which is how we organize and label stuff. Interaction design and interface design, which encompasses activities like wireframing and visual design, and what's on the screen, how do people use it, what do those elements look like, bringing in our Gestalt principles. And then heuristics and usability, which is how do we evaluate our designs against either some best practices, some heuristics, or against real world users on the usability side. So this is a vast landscape, and while that is overall a good thing because it means there is a lot under the UX umbrella, it does have an important caveat that goes along with it. And that is that it is very unusual for one person to be equally good at all four quadrants of this graphic, which is why you're starting to see people specialize in one area or another. Now, of course, if you're a user experience team of one, in Leah Bewley's words, then you might have to do a little bit of all these things. But don't feel bad if you feel somewhat overwhelmed, because this is an overwhelming domain or landscape to try and cover yourself. Finally, when we talk about Agile and UX, one of the questions that someone asked me is, hey, there's an Agile manifesto that's pretty famous. Why isn't there a UX manifesto? Well, there isn't a UX manifesto, but the closest we have is something that is also very old, still gets talked about and debated, and is still very good. And that's Jacob Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics from 1994. Now, whatever you think about the usability heuristics, the details of them, are some of them redundant? And those are some of the same complaints that people have made about the Agile manifesto. Overall, this is a foundational document that's still very influential on our practice. So much like Agile, UX has this history that we look back at and we say, these are some principles, some ideas that we all ought to internalize. And sure, we can debate them and maybe depart from them, but you at least have to learn them before you can go off and do something else. All right, I'm gonna try a second poll and we'll see if this goes. It should already be live in in the Q&A session.
Yeah, Joshua, we're having trouble finding your polls, so
Okay.
maybe that we can get them added to your Q&A session and people can fill them out then.
All right. I do actually see now a few more votes in my Q&A session. So looks like some people were able to find them. So if you don't see them, I apologize. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that out of the people who voted on this question, we had about 2/3 who said I'm a UXer. About 29% of people said I'm something else. And a few people said, 5% of people said I'm a software developer. So not unexpectedly, we are mostly talking to ourselves here. We're at 24 hours of UX and 2/3 of the audience considers themselves UXer. So that's good and maybe natural, but maybe I really ought to be giving this talk at a developer conference or at a product management conference or project management or whatever got lumped into I'm neither a UXer nor a software developer. I was curious about that. Actually, 2/3 of people considering themselves UXers is a little less than what I thought this would come out as. I thought it would be more like 80-20. All right, so now that we've covered our definitions, we can talk about why the UXer and the Agilist should be friends. You can sing it along to the tune of the farmer and the plowman should be friends, and keeping with that Old West theme of the good, the bad, and the ugly. I drew this amazing graphic to show how UX and Agile overlap. And let's start the graphic at the circle labeled Agile, because that's how I came to things. I was a business analyst. I worked on an Agile project, fell in love with it. Extreme programming is my first love of Agile, but I'm also a certified Scrum Master because Scrum is, of course, the dominant version of Agile now. In any case, when you learn about Agile, Agile will often recommend user stories that recognize the importance of users' needs. Users' needs are the focus of user-centered design. UCD, of course, is part of that larger landscape of user experience, and therefore user experience should be best friends with Agile. Both of them put users at their center. This is a good thing. This is a strong reason why the farmer and the plowman, or the Agilist and the UXer, should be friends. The ugly thing about this is this graphic itself. Yes, I do not have a strong visual design background, and that is being illustrated right here. But digging even more into the ways that Agile and UX overlap, we can look at my favorite version of Agile, Extreme Programming, or XP, and some of those principles on the left side of this slide. So principles like think, collaborate, and release. And then we can look at some roughly analogous UX and design thinking concepts on the right-hand side of this slide. If you twitched a little bit when I said the words design thinking, don't worry, I'm only using it as an organizing concept. There could be a whole other presentation about design thinking, maybe next year. So in any case, if you look at an XP principle like think, there's a pretty roughly analogous UX principle, empathize or define, collaborate, ideate, release, prototype, maybe. And even some of the details match up pretty nicely. Informative workspace on the XP side. Well, we're UXers, we've got pictures everywhere. That's informative. Root cause analysis. Of course, as UXers, we say we need to validate our assumptions. Retrospectives. Well, we do a design review. That's essentially a specialized retrospective. But the more interesting comparison is the places where they do not overlap. So sit together. Well, this one's a little dated. I mean, how many of us sit together thanks to COVID and thanks to the increasing virtualization? But it's an extremely important XP principle, meaning work closely together with the people who are all on the same, product or service or organization that you're working in. Well, this was not really done historically on the design side. We'll talk about why a little bit later. XP also has a very important concept called done, meaning we don't release code until it has a whole array of tests around it, until it's delivering value, meeting all of our requirements. We know how we're going to measure it and maintain it. I'm not sure that design really has that strong of a done concept in it. So that's starting to diverge a little bit. We can look at some more of the XP principles and the roughly analogous UX principles. Plan maps up pretty nicely to define and ideate. Develop, which is where you do the work, maps up pretty nicely to prototype and test. But the one piece that doesn't really map up nicely here at the detail level is this concept in XP of incremental requirements, that incrementalness that I said was part of the definition of Agile. Well, that's not really a UX design strength, at least historically. There have, of course, been lots of attempts over the years, and I'll go through quite a few of them to make UX design fit into these incremental development methods. But from the jump, not really a lot of overlap there. So keep this in mind as we start talking about why can't we get along? We can't get along because UX is historically hostile to Agile, because Alan Cooper was wrong, because Kim Goodwin was highly influential. Also, Steve Krug was overly optimistic about research. And finally, Jeff Sutherland mortally wounded Agile in 2014. So yes, I am calling out a lot of big names here. If any of them happen to ever see this presentation, please know that I value all of your contributions. All of your books are on my shelf. And I only call you out because of how influential you were. Without you, we wouldn't even be here to have this conversation. But here goes. Who's Alan Cooper? He describes himself as a software designer and programmer. He's the father of Visual Basic, and he founded Cooper, which is an influential interaction design consultancy way back in 1992. So interestingly, Alan Cooper does not define himself as a designer, despite being very influential on design. He's the author of 2 books that you've probably read or at least heard of. One is called About Face, and the other is called The Inmates Are Running the Asylum. I'm really going to focus on inmates. The inmates are running the asylum, why high-tech products are driving us crazy or drive us crazy, and how to restore the sanity. Originally published 1998, still very early on, sort of right before the dot-com boom and bust. The key message of Inmates is you have to know your users' goals and how to satisfy them. And the how to restore the sanity is use interaction design. Inmates is also incredibly influential because it popularized personas as a tool. Whatever you think about personas, and they could be used in a good way or a bad way, they could be done well or poorly, they are a useful tool in our toolbox, and Alan Cooper is the one who popularized them with this book. But when he writes something like the iterative method means extra work for people, that makes us tilt our head and say, wait, what? That's not the point of Agile or the iterative method, as Alan Cooper calls it. And when he says that iterative process relieves people of having to perform rigorous planning, thinking, and due diligence, in other words, interaction design, that makes me want to say, poor Alan, can you show us on the doll where the bad software development process hurt you? I was reading this chapter of Inmates made me think that maybe, unfortunately, Alan Cooper was exposed to a lot of places kind of doing a bad job of trying to be Agile, or just not being Agile at all, but doing some sort of other, iterative method that gave him this, this sort of wrong-headed feeling about how it was extra work. However, the more I thought about this sarcastic joke that I put here in Comic Sans to make it extra sarcastic, I wanted to back off and acknowledge that Cooper does touch a nerve when he writes that part of the appeal of the iterative process, part of the appeal of Agile, is that it relieves us from that rigorous planning, thinking, and product due diligence. He's saying that part of the appeal of Agile is that it removes the need for hard work. Rigorous planning and thinking is hard and time consuming, and the modern day obsession with speed that has infected Agile leaves neither time nor energy for thinking and planning. So he was wrong, but he was also kind of right. Well, then there's a couple other places where I take exception to what Alan Cooper wrote. So he wrote, iteration never creates great products, harsh words, and I think pretty much demonstrably wrong. Iteration can lead to great products when done properly. I mean, after all, we believe that on the design side as well. Your first design is never your best design. By definition, you have to iterate your design in order to get to a great design. But then in the very next chapter, he says, getting to the right product is always a matter of iterating. So, at least make up your mind, Alan Cooper. It can't be both never and always. He writes that interaction design can reduce the number of iterations you need to do. And again, as I step back from my sarcasm, I can acknowledge that doing the hard work of interaction design can reduce the number of iterations we need, if not the fact that we need some iterations. And after all, here in 2022, we're not making up web and app interactions from whole cloth the way we were in the 1990s. We have established patterns and principles to draw upon. But where he goes wrong is when he says that there's an enormous cost in each new version of a product. That might be true for physical products, but it's really not as true for digital products. And I think that atavistic fear of iterating your products set UX at odds with Agile from the early days. Which brings us to Kim Goodwin. She was the VP of design at Cooper, at the Interaction Design Company. She is a longtime independent consultant, and she is the author of another very influential book called Designing for the Digital Age from 2009, the Bible of UX design, the first book to explain how to do a design project, at least the way agencies do one, and in great detail. It's 739 pages long. It is a big, thick tome. It is great. It's a great book. It's used as a textbook in some UX design programs, including the one at Kent State. But it has some problems within it. Here we have Goodwin mocking Agile, and what's more, mocking the stakeholders within an Agile project, the annoying stakeholders who can't agree on anything until they have something to look at. Maybe the solution is just to start building the thing and iterate your way to requirements. But when we laugh at this joke, it's with bitter laughter because Goodwin is somewhat correct. Many stakeholders do reject any possibility of sitting down to hash out requirements. Instead, they push for software to be built so that we have something to look at and play with, and so that we justify all the money we're paying the developers. In Goodwin's last sentence, she offers the solution, which is use prototypes or sketches. I think that part is right, but I think the mockery here, the mockery of both Agile and the Agile stakeholders, set a tone for UX designers, putting us again at odds and making us unable to get along as well as we should. When Goodwin isn't mocking Agile, she might be damning it with faint praise, writing that Agile might work, but only if you have skilled engineers working on a simple product. You can almost hear the sneering in the writing here. Her solution, and it echoes what she wrote previously, is for the designers to iterate their sketches before the coding begins. So two super important concepts are getting established here. First, that designers and developers work separately, that these are separate groups of people, separate teams. And second, that designers do their work before the developers do theirs. So again, from the early days, UX is setting itself apart from Agile. What can make your Agile project successful, Goodwin writes, is to have an established visual system and a small engineering team working closely with you. Yes, absolutely right. The small dedicated team is supposed to be a prerequisite for Agile to work properly. Problem is, we don't often get it. She also writes that the more engineers there are on a project, the greater the likelihood of inconsistency in skills, judgment, and interpretation. Haha, we laugh at the joke that she makes, but the joke doesn't go far enough. Everybody has inconsistency in skills and judgment and knowledge and interpretation. That's maybe just part of the diversity of humanity. You know, she continues on that less skilled engineers might be likely to take shortcuts. I'm going to cross out less skilled and just write engineers are likely to take shortcuts. Maybe just cross out the first whole, 3 words there and say people are likely to take shortcuts. The antidote goes back to having strong requirements and that established visual system that Goodwin mentioned. But how often do we have either of those things, let alone both? Alan Cooper and Kim Goodwin set Agile and UX at odds with mockery mixed with some biting true commentary about the difficulties of working together. Those difficulties have been true for 30 years and partly explain why we can't get along. Let me come to Steve Krug, who I said was overly optimistic. Krug is one of the fathers of discount usability testing, Jacob Nielsen being the other one. And of course, by discount usability testing, we mean cheap. How do you do usability testing in a way that's cost effective and time effective? Krug has 25 years as a usability consultant. He's the owner and founder of the consulting firm Advanced Common Sense, and of course, the author of 2 really, really good books. Don't Make Me Think, originally from the year 2000, then updated in 2014, and Rocket Surgery Made Easy from 2010. Both of these, of course, about usability testing. And the key message that Krug gives us is, well, to do discount usability testing, to do it cheaply, you have to regularly talk to people and observe them using your product with kind of a side helping of, and it's not as hard as you think, it's not as bad, we can do this. But I think he was overly optimistic. How often should we do this usability testing thing? He originally said a morning a month, and then when he updated his book, he said a morning every iteration. So that's a morning of usability testing every 1 to 2 weeks, depending on how long your Agile iterations are, to which I say, eek, I don't know how you can move that fast unless it's someone's full-time job to recruit and wrangle people. You could outsource that job to another company, or you could use a remote unmoderated testing platform, which is a form of outsourcing. But even if you do that, somebody still has to coordinate all that research. And it's not enough that the research just happens. You need someone to interpret the results. The other thing where I think Steve Krug was overly optimistic about is saying, hey, a morning a month or a morning every iteration, we can get the whole development and design team to observe the usability tests. Boy, I don't know where Steve Krug has worked, but most of the places I've worked, pulling the developers away from anything other than billable hours writing code is extremely difficult. So I think Krug is setting out a promise here that that UX cannot necessarily fulfill to the Agile side. Speaking of Agile, Jeff Sutherland, the co-creator of Scrum, the concept. He's the founder of Scrum Inc., the company, and he describes himself as a West Point graduate, former fighter pilot, and cancer researcher. He's also the CTO of 11 different software companies. So Jeff Sutherland is a technologist, an engineer, a developer, not a UX designer, and that's fine. He's the author of a book called Scrum, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time. Oh dear, that subtitle. As the co-creator of Scrum, which is the dominant flavor of Agile, Sutherland's words carry enormous weight. But Agile was never supposed to be about speed. You say that something is going to do twice the work in half the time. That is a promise of speed. Once speed becomes the driving force, it squeezes out everything that is perceived as not speedy, such as proper UX design, proper technical architecture, proper testing, maintaining all that junky code. Maybe we need DevOps because this relentless focus on speed has done away with anything that would have given us truly done software that's actually maintainable and not a pile of spaghetti. So there's my hot take for this slide. That subtitle of the book reminds me of a very famous Far Side cartoon where you're talking to your dog and you say a bunch of words to the dog, but the only thing the dog hears is her name, Ginger. So what I think CEOs heard in that Scrum book title was blah, blah, twice the work, blah, blah. Twice the work makes dollar signs show up in their eyes. That is bad. That was never intended to be the premise of Agile, that it was purely a speed and money play. What they didn't hear in the book title, but should have, was rely on people, deliver value, eliminate waste, seek technical excellence, improve your process. Those are all the good parts of Agile that are not being emphasized in a subtitle like how to do twice the work and half the time. Alan Cooper and Kim Goodwin set UX at odds with Agile from the early days. Steve Krug's over-optimism promised user research within the iteration on a cadence that UX can't really maintain. And Jeff Sutherland insisted that the only thing that matters about Scrum is speed. These are foundational reasons why Agile and UX can't get along. Can we reconcile? There have been attempts at reconciliation from the very earliest days. Way back in 2003, we have a couple of authors at a particular conference where they described and sketched out the intertwining of UX and development. Keep that word intertwining in mind. You're about to see several graphical depictions of it. A couple years later, Lynn Miller presented a paper at an Agile conference where she writes about parallel design and development tracks. So parallel of necessity means separate because parallel lines do not cross, at least in the geometric sense. And all this leads up to an extremely influential article by Desirée in 2007, where she writes about staggered sprints. This is in the Journal of Usability Studies. So this is a big deal. C divides things into cycles. We would now call them iterations. And I know the graphic is a little bit blurry, but the top track is the developer track and the bottom track is the interaction designer track. So here you have those parallel tracks, and you also have this back and forth intertwining as code and design is being handed off in different directions. It almost reminds me of sort of a sideways DNA helix. One thing I want to call out here is on the developer track, you are essentially doing the same thing over and over. You're implementing designs. Now, maybe there are certain types of features, high cost, low UI, that's fine. But overall, implement designs, implement designs, implement designs. But on the interaction designer track, you're doing 2 types of design, or maybe 3 types of work where you're testing the code from the previous cycle, as she calls it, and then you're designing for the next cycle and you're gathering customer data for the following cycle. So that's interesting. Put a pin in that and we'll come back to that. Desirée C's staggered sprints was in turn very influential on a concept called dual track Agile. That was popularized by Marty Cagan of the Silicon Valley Product Group in 2012. He and Jeff Patton wrote about this extensively. Cagan, of course, is the author of books like Inspired, which are very foundational books in the product management discipline. But in any case, here you can see another set of 2 different tracks. We have product discovery track and product execution track. And there's some sort of feeding of work from product discovery into product execution. Fast forward to the next year, we get to Lean UX, a book by Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden. And they say there is a cycle that you go through when you want to do Lean UX. You can enter it at any point. Let's just say we enter it at the top. We have some assumptions or hypotheses. We can design it. We can create an MVP or a minimum viable product, take it out for research and learning, and that will give us some outcomes that will, validate our assumptions or not, and then we can feed it back into the cycle. So the cycle is okay and relatively unobjectionable, but I feel like just saying design it glosses over a lot of work. Well, what do you mean by design it? And they don't really address that too much in the book. They do give us a user validation schedule where they say, all right, there's a 2-week sprint. And at the beginning of it, you should have an iteration planning meeting. Oh, and before that, you should do some sketching and ideation. And you should do some testing for usability and value within the confines of that sprint. Yes, great idea. This is the Steve Krug promise, a morning every iteration. It's just really hard to execute on that, though. The other thing that I think is funny about this graphic is you've got a color key, right? Red is iteration planning, green is sketching, blue is testing. Well, what's the orange? Oh, well, that's the development work. That doesn't need a key because, that's obviously the most important part of the graphic. Google's design sprint, 2012 through about 16, as they're, working and building up the concept and eventually publishing the book. Instead of that sort of Lean UX cycle where we go idea, build, launch, and learn, the Google Design Sprint, gives teams a shortcut to learning without building and launching. I mean, this harkens back to what Alan Cooper wrote in 2004. Nobody wants to learn the hard, slow way. Nobody wants to go all the way around the circle. We want to do it the easy, fast way. The promise is that working together in a sprint, a Google Design Sprint, you can shortcut the endless debate cycle and compress months of work or months of time into a single week. I mean, that sounds like a late night infomercial. So how are we going to do this, Google? Well, they tell you the operational details, what to do on each day of the design sprint. Now it ends with testing a prototype with real live humans. Yes, that's good. You should absolutely do that. You should test at any level of prototype fidelity. But then the whole thing becomes very hand wavy. Just figure out what you're going to do next. Maybe you update your prototype. Does that translate into changes to your product? Or maybe you decide to focus on a new set of questions and assumptions. Does that mean you're done with the previous product after a week? I mean, this is just ugly, this amount of hand waviness here. The other thing that struck me is that the Google Design Sprint isn't agile, it's fast waterfall. It tells you what to do on each day of the week, and the later activities can't start until the previous activities are completed. This is an old school project manager Gantt chart in new clothing. In fact, when I was searching for a diagram to represent this badly done version of Agile, I came across this absolutely amazing specimen. Here we have the waterfall process on the left, and then on the right we have exactly the same process, but shown in a loop. That doesn't make it Agile. The point of Agile was to do a little bit of everything within each increment of value in any order, whatever order made sense, and possibly, looping back and forth from one thing to another. Maybe you do a lot of design and only a little bit of deployment, and sometimes you development, sometimes you write requirements, not to do the same steps in the same order, but faster and somehow in a circular motion. In 2017, Paige Laupheimer of the Nielsen Norman Group puts his finger on a problem in these ongoing attempts to reconcile Agile with UX. He writes, users don't interact only with small parts of our designs in isolation. They use our products to accomplish larger goals. Yes, absolutely correct. Scrum and Agile user stories are often focused at too granular of a level, what we would now call micro interactions, optimizing that tiny piece of functionality but overlooking the user's overall goals and tasks. It doesn't do us much good to have a beautifully designed and coded configuration wizard on an e-commerce site if the overall experience of shopping on that site is terrible. So let's call this the ugly truth of modern software development. We're getting better at all those micro interactions, but we're still ignoring the overall experience. In 2018, there's an article in the magazine of the UXPA titled Agile UX, it's not as bad as you think. Now that reminds me of some of the jokes that people here in Cleveland, Ohio tell, like Cleveland, at least we're not Detroit. Anytime you have to use the word grudgingly to describe how people behave, you're facing a pretty steep uphill climb. There's got to be some underlying reasons for people grudgingly accepting something or being disgruntled around it. We also see a very classic phrase, when done right, which puts me in mind of some of the late night college BS sessions around how communism would be great when done right, but those darned real world people keep doing it wrong. So if agilized UX only works when done right, then there is a serious underlying problem with both Agile and UX. If they're too hard for those darned real world people to do right, then what's the solution? Change human behavior? That's extremely difficult and basically a fool's errand. Maybe we need to change our approach. I do have to pause here to state that one of the authors of this article, Nicole Durr, is a friend of mine, and I've served on a board with Becky Bristol, so I only mock them with love. In 2019, Scrum.org gets in the game with a class on how to bridge Scrum and UX. Now, for clarity, Scrum.org is the other Scrum organization, the one created by Ken Schwaber, the other co-creator of Scrum, so not Jeff Sutherland. That's right, just like in many movies, the real-life co-creators of Scrum split up and made rival organizations. In fact, I kind of want to see a movie about this. In any case, one of the rules of Scrum is thou shalt not have work that extends beyond the sprint. So it is astounding that this course actually acknowledges that design work might have to do just that, extend beyond the sprint. And I say this gets a good label because admitting that you have a problem is the first step on the road to recovery. Admitting that you cannot fit everything into that arbitrary time box is overall a positive thing. In 2019, in the Journal of Usability Studies, we have 3 authors presenting what they call AUX3, Agile UX with 3 tracks. And I want to point out that these 3 tracks are all tracks for the UX designer. So this isn't a development track and a design track. These are essentially all design tracks. They say there is a learning track where we do research methods like ethnography, a problem-solving track where we do wireframes and interaction design, and an execution track where we do visual design and sign language development. Now, let's take a closer look at what the UX team is promising to do in each iteration. So, okay, you're gathering user info for upcoming iterations. We can see it might be as many as 4. We're designing for the immediately following iteration, so that's 1. And then we're implementing designs for the current iteration, so that's 1. 4 plus 1 plus 1 equals 6. This isn't doing twice the work. This is doing 6 times the work. I guarantee you do not have 6 times as many designers on a team as you do developers. In fact, I would bet that your ratio is more like 6 to 1 on the other side, if not more like 20 to 1. So this seems absolutely insane to me as an attempt at reconciliation. Forrester Research makes an important point in this January 2021 research report that we have 2 different disciplines with different cultures. If Agile and UX were different tribes of people, we would expect them to clash precisely because of their lack of shared artifacts and ceremonies. Now, in human societies, tribes of people have come together, adopted each other's customs, and created a new blended culture. But that takes a long time. And both Agile and UX are relatively immature disciplines on a human scale. Think about it this way. Many of us here are old enough that in our lifespans, we were working before either Agile or UX was invented, or at least before it had a name. It could be multiple more generations before our 2 tribes blend successfully. Finally, and this is the only one of my sources that is not in chronological order, simply because it's the definitive summation. This is going back a year to 2020. UX Matters asked a panel of experts the question, is focusing on Agile or Lean damaging the practice of UX? And the answer was a resounding yes. The panelists mentioned shortcuts, exactly what Alan Cooper warned us about. They lament the focus on speed, exactly what Jeff Sutherland brought about with his Scrum book subtitle. And they note how it's difficult for product teams to keep the bigger picture in mind, exactly what Paige Laupheimer of Nielsen Norman Group stated. One of the panelists says he doesn't see much actual Lean or Agile at all. Not Lean or Agile UX, any Lean or Agile. He just sees a chase for productivity gains at the expense of all else. Maybe the inevitable outcome of trying to do twice the work in half the time. If you'd like to be even more depressed, you can seek out this article and read all of it. I do have all of my sources in the slide deck at the end. Of course, you can probably also Google this title. So let's, to take our minds off that depressing article, I'm going to look at another one of my polls. And this is a very simple question. How is your company funded? Is it a venture-backed startup, or is it any other funding method? Do you sell a product or service? Are you a nonprofit? Essentially anything other than being a venture-backed startup. The very binary question. I'm going to pop over into my Q&A session. And I do see a decent number of votes here. This is actually a little surprising to me. I was expecting this to be like 99% are not a venture-backed startup, but in fact, it is 18% venture-backed startup and 82% some other funding method. So the reason I asked this question is that many of the methods I've discussed, the attempts to reconcile Agile and UX, come out of that venture capital culture that 18% of us work for, which is great. And sometimes that culture is explicitly saying things about Agile and UX, as in the case of Marty Cagan's Silicon Valley Product Group. Sometimes it's more implicit in the case of some of the other books. But given that the vast majority of us, given that more than 80% of us don't work for a venture-backed startup, and given that the harsh truth is that the vast majority of all venture-backed startups fail, why are we emulating them? Why are we otherwise rational business people in stable, non-venture-backed businesses trying to be something that we're not? Food for thought. As I wrap up this section, many of the recommendations in these articles show that kind of back and forth handoff of work from one team to another. Intertwined sprints that are separate, where we have to cross things. What else makes that V shape and is used in a back and forth motion is a saw. And like using a saw blade to cut through wood, separating your Agile and UX teams is going to end up cutting your organization apart, cutting you off from your customers, cutting you off from delivering truly great user experiences. Instead, you're optimizing for speed, you're optimizing for micro interactions. We should be friends, Agile and UX, like the farmer and the plowman, because both of us, both Agile and UX, put users' needs at our center. But as I've shown, UX's roots include a lot of hostility towards Agile, or maybe misunderstandings of Agile. And Agile maybe has lost its own way by overemphasizing speed above all else. Most of our attempts at reconciliation propose some kind of parallel tracks and frequent handoffs that risk cutting us apart. Or the attempts at reconciliation have UX just vastly overpromising the amount of research or interaction design that can be done within a sprint. We're going to do 2, 3, 6 times as much work in a sprint. So what do I recommend? Back to that XP principle, sit together. Okay, had to cross out sit, work together, even if they don't let you. Nothing can stop them, whoever they are, from you getting on a Zoom call or some sort of collaboration software, whether you're a developer, a designer, or anything else, and bringing the right people into the conversation, talking to each other, keeping those user needs at the center. Designers, Kim Goodwin was right about this. You do need to build design systems, pattern libraries, and standards. You need those things because of the natural human tendency to want to take shortcuts. So people want to take shortcuts, give them the tool that will allow them to take a shortcut in a way that still leads to good design. To Alan Cooper's point, there's no shortcut though for hard work, for the hard work of interaction design, for the hard work of UX research. You have to do that stuff, but you can't overpromise you're going to do double up to 6 times the amount of work as a developer in a single sprint, especially given that you're already outnumbered on that team. That kind of overpromising is not doing you or the profession of UX any good. Developers, you got to be willing to refactor. Yes, there is that XP concept of done, but there's also a concept of technical debt, of paying it down, and of refactoring. And after all, iterate. Iterate is one of the core concepts of Agile. And plan. Another core concept of Agile. I'm not sure, maybe we can blame it on Jeff Sutherland, but I really think this was a problem in Agile long before that book. Somehow this idea that Agile means we don't do any planning. Well, that's just not right. There are all sorts of planning rituals and planning techniques that go into Agile. James Shore has 2 entire chapters of his book about it that I encourage you to read or reread. Those are my recommendations. I am done throwing shade at everyone within arm's reach, and I can now take your questions and hopefully give some answers, both verbally, and I'll also take a look at the Q&A section here. I'll put up a slide for you to look at while I am taking questions and answers, and I will enable my last poll so that you can tell me if you found this session valuable.
Thank you, Joshua. That was awesome. Lots of great comments in the comments section. I saw 2 things in the Q&A, which we'll try to cover briefly here, and then we'll probably just spend more time in the Q&A session itself.
Okay.
So one was specifically around Jeff Patton's user story mapping. You mentioned Patton, but you didn't go into his mapping technique. What do you think about that?
I am a fan of user story mapping. So essentially the technique is not just having a whole bunch of user stories, but actually breaking down what are the tasks, what are the actions that some user is taking, mapping those stories onto that, and then sort of drawing lines. And they're either horizontal or vertical, depending on who taught you this method, but drawing lines and saying, well, here's our first release, here's our MVP, here's our second most important thing, and so on. It's an extremely useful method. Don't get me wrong. Just because I somewhat object to the dual track Agile that Marty, Cagan, and Jeff Patton wrote about, I have no objection to user story mapping. I think it's a great and valuable technique. And by the way, also something that James Shore brought into the redo of his book, The Art of Agile Development.
Cool. Another quick one, because about another minute, then we'll start to transition. You threw shade on lots of things, but you didn't throw shade on the word user. So, how can we, come up with better terms or different terms than that?
Well, now I get to mention one of the greatest bon mots of all time, which is there are only 2 industries that refer to their customers as users: illegal narcotics and software development. So that is a quote that really stabs us right in the heart. I don't know. I guess we could blame Don Norman for calling it user experience instead of customer experience, way back in the 90s. I know we have another speaker later today who's a big fan of the term CX instead of UX. Yeah, that term user is a little demeaning, a little vague. You should really think about, who are you designing for? Is it a customer? Is it a client? Is it an employee? You could be even more specific. It's a student. It's a driver. Shaza, did I found a religion? I don't know if I founded it, but after all, I do have the name of the guy who led people into the promised land. Right. So I will take it. I'll take the prophet designation here,
or at least debunked several other ones, or took a shot at them, and
right.
and perhaps left a void for some other.
Right. I welcome debate. As a guy who studied philosophy, I want to see someone come back next year and mention me on a slide and say how Joshua Randall was wrong about something.
Cool. Well, again, thank you, Joshua. This was great. Lots of good interaction. Lots of again, I loved it. Lots of references to the history. So you and I have been around a little bit longer than other folks, and so I know you spent a lot of time going back and digging up a book from 1990 and actually reading it and seeing what it makes sense. So I think that's something we need to do more as a profession. So Johannes, you want to go ahead, and I think we'll starting getting ready for the next session. And Joshua, I'm going to follow you over to your Q&A session and help out there.
All right, thank you.